Hello there, and welcome back to the Bible story, the Queen Esther storyline. My name is Dan Woolridge, and these pictures are used with permission from the Glory Story Project. This is a sweeping overflight of the Bible story of Queen Esther in the time of the Medes and Persians. In the Bible, the word story always implies a true story of events that actually happened. Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel were all alive during the 70 years Babylonian captivity of the Jewish people. Daniel, Ezekiel were taken prisoner. Nehemiah, Ezra, Haggai, Zechariah, Zerubbabel were among the enslaved Jewish prisoners in Babylon during the captivity. After Babylon was conquered by the Medes and Persians, Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. Zerubbabel, at the urging of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, started to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and Ezra, who was also amongst the captives, came back and became the high priest. The book of Esther is set during the empire of the Medes and Persians. Esther becomes the queen to the king in Persia around 470 odd years before Christ. The Jewish feast of Purim is still celebrated today and celebrates Queen Esther and the deliverance of the Jews from the wicked Haman. And that's what this story is all about. King Ahasuerus was an immensely wealthy and powerful king over a huge empire. He ruled over 120 lands, stretching from India to Ethiopia. In the third year of the king's reign, he decided to hold a 7-day banquet. As the men got drunk, the king summoned his wife to appear in her royal dress. He wanted to show her off. So that he could show to everybody her exceptional beauty. But the queen refused to come. He was furious. All the princes, nobles, and kings of provinces that were gathered with him all agreed that if his queen was to defy a royal decree like this, then all the women in the land would start defying their husbands. And consequently, the king was furious. The queen must go, demanded the king. Living in the land was a Jewish man named Mordecai, who was looking after his young cousin, Esther. Everybody thought that Mordecai had adopted Esther. They didn't know that she was a Jewess. When the king was choosing a new wife, Esther was included, and at first sight of her the king loved her and wanted her as his wife. But still no one knew that Esther was a Jewish. Not even the king knew she was Jewish. Esther was chosen to be queen and went to live in the king's palace. Mordecai would come and visit the queen daily. One day, Mordecai overheard two of the king's servants, chamberlains, plotting to assassinate the king. Political intrigue. Mordecai went to Queen Esther and told her to warn the king. The plot was discovered and the two men were arrested. And Mordecai's action was recorded in the palace records. Sometime later, the king appointed a new prime minister, a principal minister, a man called Haman. Haman ordered everybody to bow before him, which they did except Mordecai. Mordecai told people that he was Jewish and wasn't going to bow before anybody but God. "I'll speak to the king about this and get this sorted out," said Haman. "Your Majesty, there are people in the land that do not recognize your ultimate authority or obey your laws. You must issue a royal decree to destroy them all, men, women, and children." The king said to Haman, "The people are given to you to do with whatever seems fit. So now we have the arch enemy of the Jews, Haman, given power over the people. And later the king and Haman sat down to drink. Letters were sent throughout the entire land under the seal of the king that all the Jews, men, women, and children, were to be destroyed on one particular day, and all their possessions seized as forfeit. The letters went throughout the land. Mordecai and all the Jews throughout the land were now weeping and wearing clothes of sackcloth and ashes, because they knew the day of their destruction was coming by royal decree. Queen Esther was deeply distressed and sent Mordecai clothes so he could put off the sackcloth. If you were wearing sackcloth, you couldn't come into the king's court. She wanted to speak to him. So she sent the clothes so that he could enter the king's court. But he refused. He refused to put on the clothes. He stayed in his sackcloth. She also sent a servant to see Mordecai. Mordecai explained and sent Esther a copy of the letter that had been sent throughout the land, stipulating that on a certain day all the Jews were to be exterminated and their possessions totally seized. Haman is going to kill all the Jews. Please tell Queen Esther to plead our case before the king. That's the message Mordecai sent to Esther. Esther knew quite well that she faced death if she went into the king's presence without an explicit invitation. If you went into the king's presence without an invitation and he didn't point the royal scepter at you, you did so on the pain of death. Mordecai told her to go ahead regardless or face the dire consequences. So Esther put on her royal robes to enter the king's presence, and she said these famous words, "If I perish, I perish." Esther stood in the face of death. The king saw her and pointed to her with his golden scepter, so she could draw near. "What do you want, Queen Esther? I'll give you up to half of my kingdom," the king said. So Esther asked, "Could the king and Haman have dinner with me tonight?" In the meantime, Haman was building a gallows for Mordecai's execution. His wife and his friends all decided that this was the way to deal with Mordecai. At dinner, Esther's only request was that the king and Haman would have a banquet dinner with her the following evening. They agreed, but that night the king couldn't sleep. So he ordered his servant, "Send someone to read me the palace records." They read to the king, and they read the account of how Mordecai had saved the king's life. And the king remembered. The very next morning the king sent for Haman and asked, "What should I do to the man whom I want to honour and exalt." Haman thought that the king was referring to him, so he replied, "The man should wear your royal robes and crown, and as he rides the king's horse through the city square, so everybody can see him and acknowledge him." The highest man in the king's palace should proclaim him as honoured before the people. The king replied to this, "Go and do so for Mordecai the Jew, and leave nothing undone that you have spoken." So Haman had to dress Mordecai in the king's clothes and robes and crown, and proclaim him especially honoured by the king. He was fuming. That night at dinner, Esther told the king that she was a Jew, and begged him to save her people. Then she explained in detail the plan to kill all the Jews. That the people in the letters were her kinsmen. So the king asked, "Who would dare to do such a thing to the queen?" Esther replied, "Him. This is the enemy sitting at the table with us," pointing at Haman. The king was furious. "For this, Haman, you will hang." And so it was that Haman was hung from the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king wrote a new royal order to favour and protect the Jews, and signed it with his own royal seal. Sent out throughout the land and the provinces across the empire. Mordecai went out dressed in the royal robes, and the whole city came alive with rejoicing and celebration. That's the story of the deliverance that God wrought using Queen Esther and Mordecai to save the Jewish people. The purpose of this storyline is to show you that the Bible is a simple book to understand if approached as a story, as a narrative. It doesn't take into account this particular story, as I've told it, about Christian doctrine and teachings. They are different subjects. I hope that you've enjoyed this story of Esther. It's an amazing story. It shows how God looks after people, looks after us, if we will trust him. An Old Testament Bible story overflight. The Bible story told as an overflight with pictures. The pictures are used with permission from the Glory Story project narrated by Dan Waldridge. A special thanks to the Glory Story. A 5-year-old can understand the Bible story. It's that easy. And God bless you. Amen.